striking with invincible power. The tongues are sharper than the sword.
We met in April 1911 in the presence of Abdul-Baha. We were greatly attracted to each other at the time, but not even dimly aware of its future bearing.
While we were on pilgrimage, Abdul-Baha stated that black and white Baha'is should not only be united, but should intermarry. He emphasized that the results of such intermarriage would be to abolish differences and disputes between black and white.
Abdul-Baha talked about the sexual myths and fears at the heart of American racism.
But neither one of us had any idea he had plans for us. Without his encouragement, we would have considered race too great an obstacle to overcome.
While the Baha'is in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere were still holding segregated meetings.
The white American Baha'is were especially hesitant to hold interracial meetings in their homes out of concern for what people might say.
My goodness. There were supposedly scientific theories about the harmful effects of racial mixing. And as a lawyer, I was quite aware of the fact that intermarriage was a criminal offense in 25 states. Certainly in my home state of South Carolina, as well as the rest of the South.
After my pilgrimage, I returned to Paris. The master had suggested that I travel to America, and I began to set my affairs in order so that I could. But I became sick. In fact, I considered myself frail in those days. I was unhappy that I could not travel to America as the master wished. But imagine my joy when I learned that Abdul-Baha intended to spend 9 weeks in France later that year. I couldn't possibly travel to America when the master was coming to Paris. And then, what greater joy still, Abdul-Baha invited me to sail with him to America on a Cedric. I still remember his marvelous, teasing voice after I accepted so eagerly. Just now you said it was too far, he laughed. But as soon as you hear of my going, it gives you strength to go.
When I learned that Abdul-Baha might travel from Egypt to America, I tried to rally the friends to the idea. In an article I wrote at Star of the West, I told the friends we should not spare any pains, nor hesitate at any sacrifices to ensure his coming.
One day, on board the Cedric, the master invited me to walk with him on the deck. He told me he saw a seed in my heart. Now is the watering time, he said. I didn't know what he meant. I thought it must be something of a spiritual nature. A moment later, he turned round again and said, I saw one seed in your heart. I wish it to produce many seeds.
When Abdul-Baha's trip became a reality, I arranged for him to speak at the Metropolitan AME Church and at Howard University, my alma mater. How pleased I was to hear the master say at Howard how happy he was to see black and white together in a meeting. For the accomplishment of unity between the colored and the white will be an assurance of the world's peace, he stated. And at the AME Church, the master called the audience a beautiful bouquet of violets gathered together, dark and light. He urged us all to yield our efforts towards the unification of the entire human race. Flowers may be variegated in color, he said, but they are all the flowers of one garden. In their never-ending variety, man finds enjoyment instead of monotony.
It was through a flower smile. You must be very good friends. I planned to spend some time in Chicago while the master continued further west with his travels. But before he left, I had to be sure of his meaning, and so I asked him plainly one morning early if I had understood aright that he wished Mr. Gregory and myself to marry. He said yes, he did wish it. I wish the white and colored people to marry, he emphasized. Then, on my intimating as a woman, I could do nothing to bring it about, he asked, do you love him? Would you marry him if he asked you? And I replied, yes. Then he said, if he loves you, he will ask you.
Later that same day, Abdul-Baha told me that it would give him much pleasure if Louise and I were to marry. I was utterly surprised. I had had no thoughts of marriage ever, let alone to a white woman. I didn't know what to say. What is the matter, Abdul-Baha asked. Don't you love her? Well, yes, as a friend, I replied. Well, think of it and let me know, he said. Marriage is not an ordinance and need not be obeyed, but it would give me much pleasure if you and Miss Matthews were married at noon on Friday. We will marry.
Marriages yet. Louis found a sympathetic minister, and we were married in a parsonage of an Episcopal church in New York City.
I wrote to my spiritual parents, Joseph and Pauline Hannon, expressing sorrow that they could not attend the wedding, but that Louisa and I were trying to be discreet and did not wish any sensational newspaper articles written. So we were exerting ourselves to avoid any attention.
Abdul-Baha was in the West. Having recently left Denver, he was on a train bound for Salt Lake City when we were married. But Louis and I felt his presence at our marriage. 3 days later, while we were honeymooning in Atlantic City, Louis wrote to Pauline Hannon describing the ceremony.
Some weeks ago, Abdul-Baha, who has watched over Louise and I with the tender solicitude of a loving father, sent me a message directing me to use the utmost judgment in regards to avoid criticism of our approaching marriage. With me, the utmost judgment was prayer for divine guidance, in which Louise heartily joined me. Our prayers have been heard and answered, and we are very happy. Every matter connected with the event went off without friction, although some things were quite difficult. On last Friday, at the residence of Reverend Everett W. Daniel, just 9 persons were present, including the minister and his wife, the bride and the groom. After the ceremony of the Church of England was completed, the groom said, "Verily, you are content with the will of God." And the bride responded, "Verily, you are satisfied with the desire of God." Then Mr. McNutt read the tablet of Abdul-Baha on marriage. Mr. Breathwaite followed with a tablet revealed to the groom 3 years ago, of which the following is an extract. "I hope that thou mayest become the herald of the kingdom, may become the means by which the white and colored people shall close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity Mrs. Bote read the tablet of Baha'u'llah protection. Then the wedding party repaired to the wedding breakfast. In this small company were gathered Christians and Jews, Baha'is and non-Baha'is, the white and colored races, England and America, and the 3 Baha'i assemblies of New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. During the ceremony, there was a light rainfall. This, Mrs. Norris says, was a Baha'i sign, the bounty of God. After the ceremony, the skies cleared, the sun shone, and everybody seemed happy. That same afternoon, we arrived here on our honeymoon. We find ourselves very harmonious and very happy.
In Atlantic City, where we honeymooned, we had time for each other, and time for Baha'i activities as well. Mrs. Elizabeth Norris, whom Louis mentioned in his letter to dear Pauline, was holding weekly meetings in her home. She welcomed white and colored alike, and put my beloved Louis to work, speaking at the meetings.
Yes, the friends of Abdul Baha'i could put each other to work with a cause. Those days were happy times for us. We were secure in the Master's warm acceptance, and we found a firm foundation for our marriage. Certainly we didn't see ourselves as flaunting the mores of our society. We were simply serving the Master by accepting his desire for us.
I told Agnes Parsons that some 2 years later, I came to understand what Abdul Baha had meant that day on the deck of the Cedric. The seed soul in my heart was the attraction between Louis and myself. The watering time, the ripening of this feeling into love, leading to marriage, its fruit. The one seed producing many seeds, the attraction of the hearts of the white and colored races to be produced by our love and marriage. Our marriage is important, therefore, as Abdul Baha has indicated. He said, I heard later, that the importance of our marriage was not understood at that time, but would be understood later. It was the first interracial marriage between these 2 races among the Baha'is, you know, and known to be brought about by Abdul Baha himself, thus encouraging interracial marriage and letting the Baha'is know that he encouraged it. In the first 2 years after we were married, there were 2 others of these marriages among the Baha'is, neither one of which I think would have taken place without the example of our love and marriage.
As I mentioned in my letter to dear Pauline Hannon, Abdul Baha had written to me in 1909, I hope that thou mayest become the herald of the kingdom, may become the means by which the white and colored people shall close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity. Louisa and I pray, and in some small measure, our marriage has fulfilled the hope of our beloved Master.